Mr. Bagaza, an army officer and former deputy chief of staff of Burundi's armed forces, was 30 years old when he ousted Michel Micombero, the president on whose watch the Burundian killings had occurred, in 1976. In Italy, Mr. Bagaza seemed to hold out a measure of promise. He had been educated in military schools in Belgium, held a sociology degree and drove himself to work at 7:30 a.m. each day, an anomaly, the Associated Press reported, on a continent where leaders usually travel in cavalcades with outriders and jeeps of soldiers toting submachine guns. With few significant exports besides coffee, the country counted heavily on foreign aid to stay afloat, and Mr. Bagaza courted relationships with Western countries as well as Soviet and Chinese allies. He was credited with inviting a limited number of Hutus into the Tutsi-dominated government and sought to improve ethnic relations by transferring Tutsi farmland to Hutus. But ethnic tensions remained, despite government protestations to the contrary. They were exacerbated by Mr. Bagaza's efforts to curtail the power of the Catholic Church, a powerful, if not universally welcome, force in Burundi since Belgian colonial rule. Most Hutus were Catholic, and Catholics accounted for 65% of the country's population. Mr. Bagaza regarded the church as a threat to his power. He shuttered Catholic broadcast and print media, banned Catholic church services on weekdays, expelled foreign missionaries, assumed control of Catholic schools and shut down Catholic-run literacy centers. By 1987, the Post reported, hundreds of foreign priests and nuns had left the country. In September 1987, Mr. Bagaza was attending a conference in Quebec of Francophone countries when the military announced in a radio broadcast the ascension to power of Maj. Pierre Buyoya as head of a military junta. Mr. Bagaza had been deposed, the communiqué asserted, by his soldiers, together with Burundi's gallant people, considering the state of the Bagaza leadership, according to an AP dispatch at the time. In the decades that followed, Burundi suffered further instability, including political overthrows and assassination, and a 12-year civil war that killed 300,000 people before it ended in 2005 amid peace talks. After a period of exile, Mr. Bagaza remained active in Burundian politics as head of PARENA, described as an extremist party of Tutsis. Mr. Bagaza was born on August 29, 1946, in Rutovu, a town in what was then Ruanda-Urundi. He was married to Fausta Bagaza and had 4 children. A list of survivors was not immediately available. At the time of Mr. Bagaza's death, Burundi, under the leadership of President Pierre Buyoya, was again mired in political turbulence and violence. Hundreds have been killed, and hundreds of thousands have fled. Jean-Baptiste Bagaza, August 29, 1946 to May 4, 2016, was a Burundian army officer and politician who ruled Burundi as president and de facto military dictator from November 1976 to September 1987. Born into the Tutsi ethnic group in 1946, Bagaza served in the Burundian military and rose through the ranks under the rule of Michel Micombero after his rise to power in 1966. Bagaza deposed Micombero in a bloodless coup d'état in 1976 and took power himself as head of the ruling Union for National Progress, Union pour le Progrès National, PARENA. Despite having participated in the genocidal killings of 1972, he introduced various reforms which modernized the state and made concessions to the country's ethnic Hutu majority. His regime became increasingly repressive after it became consolidated in 1984, especially targeting the powerful Catholic Church. His rule lasted until 1987 when his regime was overthrown in a further coup d'état and he was forced into exile. He returned to Burundi in 1994 and became involved in national politics as the leader of the Party for National Recovery, Parti pour le Redressement National, PARENA. He died in 2016. Bagaza was born in Rutovu, Burundi province in Belgian-ruled Ruanda-Urundi on August 29, 1946. His family were ethnic Hima, part of the wider Tutsi ethnic group. After studying in Catholic schools in Bujumbura, he enlisted in the army of the newly independent Kingdom of Burundi. He was sent to Belgium in 1966 where he studied at the Royal Military Academy in Brussels until 1971. He earned a sociology degree. He returned to Burundi in 1972. Bagaza was involved in President Michel Micombero's genocidal killings of ethnic Hutu in 1972, though the extent or nature of his involvement remain unclear. In May he was, at the rank of captain, appointed adjunct chief of staff of the Burundian military in charge of logistics largely because of his family's connections to the Micombero, replacing purged Hutu officer Martin Ndiahose. In November he was promoted to the rank of lieutenant colonel and made chief of the general staff. In May 1975 he was appointed to the Chamber of Accounts under the Supreme Court. Bagaza overthrew Micombero in a military coup on November 1, 1976. The constitution was temporarily suspended by a military junta, the 30-member Supreme Revolutionary Council, which declared Bagaza president on November 10, 1976. He was 30 at the time. Bagaza initiated a number of reforms after taking power, attacking corruption and making modest reforms to improve conditions for Hutus who had been targeted under the Micombero regime. He earned respect for his work ethic, as he drove himself to work at 7:30 a.m. each day instead of traveling in large cavalcades as most regional politicians did at the time. Some Hutu refugees were allowed to return from exile in Zaire and Tanzania where they had fled during the genocide. Bagaza granted a few government posts to Hutu, appointing 2 Hutu ministers in his first cabinet. Burundi's feudal system of land tenure, known as the Ubugererwe, was abolished in 1977. Some Tutsi-held land was transferred to Hutu farmers. However, Bagaza ensured that the Tutsi remained economically and politically dominant. A program of economic modernization was begun to allow the emergence of small-scale capitalist agriculture, involving the construction of 2 new hydroelectric dams which still form the basis for Burundi's energy infrastructure. He also initiated road-building programs, expanded the availability of drinking water, and developed a port on Lake Tanganyika. His infrastructure investments helped to shape Burundi's export economy, which came to rely on coffee, tea, and sugar. Internationally, Bagaza successfully maneuvered between different political factions, securing economic aid from the Western Bloc, the Eastern Bloc, China, and the Arab world. Bagaza's regime introduced a new national constitution in 1981 which consolidated Burundi as a one-party dictatorship under the Union for National Progress, Union pour le Progrès National, PARENA, which he reorganized under his own leadership. In the election of 1984, he was re-elected president with 99.6% of the national vote. After the election, Bagaza organized a military operation against the Catholic Church in Burundi, regarding it as a threat to his power. The church was increasingly targeted as the regime became increasingly repressive. Foreign missionaries were expelled and attempts were made to break its influence over the public and education. Bagaza banned Catholic media and church services, closed church-run literacy centers, and ordered the arrest and torture of church figures. He also tried to implement other eccentricities such as restricting bar openings and officially limiting the time as well as money Burundians were allowed to spend for traditional betrothal and mourning ceremonies. Bob Kruger argued that these policies ultimately alienated too many Burundians and led to Bagaza's deposition. A military coup broke out in September 1987, led by Major Pierre Buyoya, while Bagaza was abroad in Quebec, Canada. Buyoya successfully deposed Bagaza's regime and established himself as president. Bagaza himself went into exile in neighboring Uganda and later in Libya where he lived until 1993. Opposed to the empowerment of Hutu through the 1993 elections, he reportedly played a major part in the coup d'état against Melchior Ndadaye, Burundi's first democratically elected president. The putschists killed Ndadaye, but failed to maintain control. Power was consequently returned to a civilian, democratic government. Bagaza subsequently denied any involvement in the putsch. Despite the coup's failure, he returned to Burundi where he founded the Party for National Recovery, Parti pour le Redressement National, PARENA. PARENA was described as a Tutsi extremist party. He was a senator for life as a former head of state. At the time, Bagaza was known for his extreme views, including general opposition to any power-sharing agreements with Hutu factions such as the Front for Democracy in Burundi, Front pour la Démocratie au Burundi, Rutovu. He eventually began to advocate the division of Burundi into a Tutsi island and a Hutu land. On January 18, 1997, Bagaza was placed under house arrest for gathering weapons for a plot against President Buyoya. 2 months later, the house arrest was changed into a prison sentence, though he was quickly released. Bagaza was subsequently involved in the peace talks which were supposed to end the Burundian civil war. As he and PARENA as a whole tended to be opposed to the implementation of power-sharing deals with the Hutu rebels, the government placed Bagaza under house arrest and banned PARENA from November 2002 to May 2003. In 2005, there were rumors that radical followers of Bagaza were organizing a rebel group known as Justice and Liberty United Front. Tensions abated when PARENA accepted ministerial position in the newly formed coalition government. Bagaza ran as PARENA's candidate for the 2010 presidential election, but withdrew when the Burundian opposition boycotted the elections. He stepped down as head of PARENA in March 2014, and was succeeded by Zenon Nimbana. He remained the main opposition leader in the Burundian Senate, and joined the opposition boycott of the 2015 elections. Bagaza died in Brussels, Belgium on May 4, 2016 at the age of 69 of natural causes and was buried in Bujumbura on May 17, 2016. He was survived by his wife Fausta and 4 daughters. Bagaza came to power in 1976 following a coup. Ironically, it is also in the same way he was driven out of power in 1987 by President Pierre Buyoya. Bagaza, an army officer and former deputy chief of staff of Burundi's armed forces, was 30 years old when he ousted Michel Micombero, the president on whose watch the Burundian killings occurred in 1976. Born on August 29, 1946 in Rutovu, a town in what was then Ruanda-Urundi, Bagaza remained active in politics. From 1994 until his death, he led the Party for National Recovery, PARENA. He belonged to the Hima Tutsi of southern Burundi, a tribe that the Washington Post once described as a minority within a minority. Like Rwanda, its neighbor to the north, Burundi is made up predominantly of members of the Hutu tribe. The country was long ruled by the Tutsi minority until it gained independence from Belgium in 1962. Bagaza seized power in a bloodless coup on November 1, 1976 and ruled until December 3, 1987, when he was deposed in a coup. Buyoya, then an army major, instigated while the president was on a visit abroad. Bagaza lived in exile in Libya, and again in Uganda in 1998 after Buyoya put him under house arrest for allegedly plotting another coup. Thank you for watching this video.